This is Chuck at Lazarus Recovery Podcast at the junction of faith and recovery. This is balls and strikes. I'm going to talk a little bit about counterintuitive love. We tend to think we're compassionate, and if we're compassionate, then that's okay. We think that compassion is okay. That's a bit of a problem. That's something that's good. Well, it turns out that there's a thing called codependency, which is everybody has trouble figuring out what that is. I do too. But our instinct for compassion has a tendency to be torpedoed by results. And that's the counterintuitive part. The reason I'm going to talk a little bit about this now is because I've found that the Lord is zero codependent, which is a bit of a frustration because you can't manipulate somebody that's not codependent. And that leads to figuring out how should we take God, because there isn't any place that the human being isn't going to try to manipulate something. And with God, it's just there's no manipulation there. It is what it is. And you got to sort of deal with it. And if His Word is absolutely true, that's the problem. It's absolutely true. What He says goes, and what He means goes. And He doesn't have a codependent bone in His body, which seems like He's not compassionate. But that's not true, and that's why I want to talk about codependency. Because if you listen to it, you can identify with it. If you identify with it, then maybe you can identify with why softening gospel is not good. It's actually very codependent. It doesn't do anybody any favors, especially since you're not the one calling the balls and strikes. God calls the balls and strikes. And if you just change the rules and help everybody think that the rules are changed, then you're not doing anybody any favors. You're not doing anybody any favors at all. So let me talk a little bit about what some, names are changed. But what does codependency look like? The one I saw the most is parents. They have a child, which they raised. Maybe they made mistakes. Maybe it was messed up. A lot of times they did make mistakes. But the problem is they made the mistakes and they care for the kid. And he gets into drugs and alcohol and bad behavior. And their overwhelming tendency is to make up for the bad mistakes by rescuing the person from the consequences of what they're doing. And that never works, which I have to remind myself because I do that with my kids. So what's that look like? What's it look like? So I'm going to tell a couple stories. I'll mix things around. Hopefully nobody will recognize what I'm talking about. But I ran a sober house, and there was a lady who I just knew the guy because he was in the house. But I started getting phone calls from the lady who said, I'm so-and-so's mother. I said, okay, great. It's like, he said, yeah, we got problems here. And she said, she basically would do anything to have him get better because, I wasn't maybe blah, 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 blah. A million different things that she didn't do good or whatever, or it was just whatever. And that was a problem. So she was, we went through this and he wasn't getting with the program. He was not getting with the program. Started to find out he was relapsing. Whenever there was a problem, she'd come to the rescue, but it wasn't helping him. It wasn't helping him at all, and in the end, he had to leave because the house was getting sold. But The mother had to come and pay for the room. He wasn't paying for the room. It was a horror show. She had no control over the kid. And I don't think he wanted control. He basically despised his mother. And she cared 1,000,000%. She was guilty. She just do anything to have him get better. And he wasn't in the place to get better. He wasn't ready. He didn't want to pay the price to get better. And she'd probably pay any price. That was part of the problem. She'd pay any price, and he wasn't engaged in the process. So in the end, he had to leave. So he had to leave, and the house was going to shut down anyway. So he left, and she was just a wreck. I said, well, you can come and pick up his clothes. She didn't want to pick up his clothes. I mean, she'd done everything in her power to help him change. But that didn't work, no matter how much you care or how guilty you are or whatever. The hard part is to understand that you really don't have any ability to change what you desperately want to change. It's terrible to watch. I finally just had to, we had to spend our own time and energy to pack up all the stuff. Mostly stuff she'd bought him, which he disrespected her for. It was just very, very difficult. The mother was desperate for him to get better, and he was equally desperate not get better and get over on his mom. For some sort of resentment, it was just like ridiculous, devastatingly poor program. It was just awful. The thing you got to understand is, and the point I'm trying to make is that no matter what the compassion, a lot of times it can't reach a person. It just does not reach a person as desperately as you want the person to see the light and to change direction. And as much as you want to help it along and ease the burden, it just doesn't work. It works counterintuitively. It's a lot of those situations, liberal love and affection is counterintuitive. It does not work. And that's the point of this lesson is that sometimes our heart wants God to be a certain way, but he is another way. He understands exactly what it is. And he understands that misplaced compassion a lot of times doesn't work. Boundaries work. It's harsh, but that's the point I'm trying to make. It's counterintuitive. And the compassion which you think should work turns out to not work at all. It's like an immensely emotionally devastating place to find yourself where your love and your compassion doesn't work at all. That you can't you can't pay a price for them. You can't bail them out. You can't do anything. It's just, they are, not rescuable. And I think in liberal type of theology, there's no such animal. That given enough of care, everybody will come around to being good and pleasing. It's simply not so. I ran a sober house for 5.5 years, been in recovery 48 years. In AA, you say some people just don't get it. In fact, a lot of people don't get it. And the people that do get it are immensely lucky to get it. And although of us have been sober a long time, we know it's by grace, that God's grace, mercy carried us through, and prone to make mistakes, and we make mistakes, and yet God's grace carries us through. A lot of times, the biggest grace in the world is a good kick in the butt. A good shock that life has to deal with us so that we get the point. Helps us become teachable and compliant. And that's what I think what I'm trying to get. Now, I want to tell one final story. We had a guy in the house, and some guys were just complete appalling human beings. They were just appalling. They were just duplicitous and, gamey and manipulative and just awful, raunchy, disgusting people, drunk or sober, high or clean. They were just disgusting people. The more you worked with them, the more disgusted you got. They're appalling people. Just of the disgustedness was equal to any compassion you could bring up. And by the end, you're just like, no, you're gone. You're history. Have a good life as best you can. But other people were like sweethearts. They were trying. They were doing a thing. They were just nice people. Had no trouble making friends. Were friendly to everybody. They were sweethearts. And there was this particular guy. He was friends with the house manager. Was promoted from the house, and this guy was friends with the house manager and knew him. And he knew everybody in the house, and there wasn't anybody that was angry with him. He was a sweetheart, and he had parents, and he was an addict. He had a deal with his parents because he'd had so much trouble. They said, he had a deal with them that every so many days he would phone them and check in with them and let them know that he was okay, just to reassure them, because he had not been okay a number of times, and they just wanted to be reassured that he's okay. Well, at a certain point we get a phone call. My house manager got a phone call, and they passed it on to me, that the parents are calling because they're frantic because they hadn't heard from him, because he was a good guy. He called his parents, reassured them, okay, everything's going okay. And his call was overdue. And he really he'd been faithful about calling them. And they haven't heard, and they were frantic. And everybody was concerned. This guy was personable, and he was humble, and he didn't have any of the isms particularly, but he was an addict. I mean, he used, and it was dangerous for him to use. Well, this went on for a few days. But then the call that was most dreaded, we got the call that was most dreaded. This guy who was in the house had been found OD'd in a car outside a drugstore a few towns away from where the house was. It was appallingly bad news. I never made it to call the parents, but I was brokenhearted. It was like, God, he wasn't on the radar as being a relapser, but it turns out that he'd been relapsing a little bit, and he just got the wrong stuff, and he was dead. To this day, I'm brokenhearted for the parents. But the thing was, as much as they loved him and they cared for him and they created a bunch of stuff to help him, the addiction claimed him. And I think that's the point that I want to make is that we have an idea that loving, compassionate people make all the difference. And actually, the best thing that some people need is not compassion, but, a good, swift kick in the butt. Need to be held accountable in a strong, strong way, without any slack. And that's not necessarily, to think that God is that way is a little bit troubling. But that's just what God is. You turn your will and your life over to the care of God as you understand Him, and He's gonna do what He has to do. It's not. I had a saying when I was getting sober: you get what you need, not what you want. And the funny thing is that's the definition of who God is. He gives you what you need, not what you want. And a lot of times our wanter is busted. And our need thing is specific and difficult. So that's what this lesson is about. Is about that counterintuitive thing that says what we want isn't necessarily what we need. Let me say again, what we want is not necessarily what we need. To make the point a little bit deeper, I said, the Bible isn't what we want, it's what we need. The definitions in the Bible, the rules in the Bible, everything is not what we want, but it's what we need. And when if you can get that principle in your head, then you're halfway there. You're halfway there. You can read the Bible and say, I think this absolutely stinks. I think this is appalling. It obviously shows God's just some sort of sadistic piece of garbage. Therefore, we are going to, since it's obvious that God is not like that, then somewhere along the line, the Bible got corrupted by legalists or something like that. And so what they do is they rewrite the Bible and they redefine it so that the God of the Bible that they read is more comfortable. It's more has this corrective thing of uber compassion and no discipline. And the simple fact of the matter is that human beings don't need sloppy, gloppy compassion. A lot of times they need a good, swift kick in the butt. If you read the Bible, and you can tolerate to read the Bible, welcome to a swift kick in the butt. The Bible is like, no, seriously, what you're doing has extremely bad consequences. You say, no, God can't. Listen to me. Trust me. You do this and you have nothing to cover that up. I will do this. You say, no, that can't be. So you correct your theology so that He won't do that. That you're always in a good stead with God no matter what you do. He forgive everything. Not Bible. Not Bible. Bible says, we all deserve, we all are going to be vulnerable to being stupid, and we're going to be stupid. So we're caught in the middle. Well, He's going to just forgive that. No, He's not going to forgive it. But He's worked out an arithmetic that works for Him. And the arithmetic is grace, saved by grace through faith. But it does not, it's not I'm going to change. You're going to give unmerited grace if they believe in me, and they surrender to me and they accept my grace. But He doesn't change His rules. He changes the way He administers those rules. And that's the thing that I want to get across. That sometimes our definition of compassion is no compassion at all. But His definition of compassion is everything. It's not the merit of the grace that we have is the merit that Jesus won, not the merit that we earned. And it's a completely different way of looking. And if you want to understand who God is, you gotta be willing to accept the difficult part. You have to accept the difficult part of the Scripture, and it goes down hard. It goes down hard because there's no codependency there. read it and you say, and you've got to accept the fact that he is who he says he is. And that's the point of this lesson. The balls and strikes are, he calls the balls and strikes according to his grace, not our grace. You know, we can't go and say, oh, he'd never do that. He most definitely will do that. If he says there's a hell, there's a hell. You know, you say, that can't be. Well, he says it is, so it is. Well, I don't believe that. That's fine. You don't have to believe that. You don't have to believe in him. And that is the linchpin of salvation, is believe who he is, what he did, and you'll be saved. You know, that's just like really, really, really difficult. So this is Chuck at Lazarus Recovery Podcast, the junction of faith and recovery. And that's the point I wanted to make in this podcast, is that your understanding of what love is not necessarily constructed on the reality of the way the world is. You have to accept the fact that God has the right to make the rules, and the rules are not going to be something you're going to like. You know, because we are capable of being codependent. We are capable of not doing anything that's good for us. And that's the point I'm trying to make, is that the hard balls and strikes of the gospel and of the Bible aren't necessarily not right because they're difficult. It's sometimes the difficult stuff is the call that's going to change things. And that's what it is that I just want you to understand that just because you don't like the way God calls it does not mean it's not true. You know, so this is Balls and Stripes, and this is Chuck at Lazarus Recovery Podcast, Junction of Faith and Recovery. Thank you much. Bye-bye.